just going to run through a couple of quick follow-up questions to matters that I've raised before, and then I want to talk about domestic violence and homelessness. And Minister, some of these probably will go to government policy. You might be able to talk about rationales, and I'm happy for the officers to then take on the consequences. The government abolished the Housing Supply Council, so who does this work now and at what cost, if any?
Sorry.
Senator, the housing supply responsibilities now rest with Department of the Treasury under the AAOs. Under the administrative arrangement orders. So they were shifted to Treasury.
Do you access a dedicated brains trust of housing supply experts within Treasury when you need advice on housing supply?
So, Senator, we work closely with officials from the Department of Treasury, in particular in their social policy division.
Within the social policy division, are there some housing specialists?
Yes, Senator. There are people with housing policy experience. In fact, the group manager, or the Treasury equivalent of the group manager over there is, in fact, used to be a former group manager of housing in the Department of Social. The then FAXIA.
Okay. The government abolished the major cities unit and also got rid of the national urban policy, and there was substantial and valuable fraction of that work that was focused on housing affordability. What's the impact of that loss been on the DSS, and how, if at all, do you feed into cities policy or urban policy more generally?
Sorry, Senator, I'm not familiar with those areas. Were they?
That's telling, I guess. That's.
Were they within our portfolio?
No, it was within Department of Infrastructure.
Right.
It was
okay.
That's telling. So major cities unit and the development of the national urban policy, I think they would have drawn on you or your predecessors, because there was a fair bit there about housing affordability and how and where to provide for supply.
So, Senator,
sure.
We work very closely not only with Treasury but also with PM&C in this space, and most recently our efforts have been very focused on the reform of federation white paper process, which is led by PM&C, which has, of course, been looking at these issues across government, not just in the DSS Treasury space.
Yeah.
Sorry, Senator, the other sort of aspect there I'd draw on also is that we work quite closely with our counterparts in the in state and territory governments as well. So we have an informal chief executive network for housing and homelessness. We also work quite closely with the Australian Housing and Urban
AHURI?
AHURI, yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Did you call that an informal CEOs network?
We do call it an informal CEO network, but it's we meet roughly on a 6-monthly basis. We also all participate in the AHURI Chief Executive Symposium each year as well.
Okay. That's the first I've heard of that CEOs network. Is that taking up any of the slack that was left by the abolition of the COAG Reform Council on Housing?
Senator, we certainly talk across matters of cross-cutting policy interests, so that includes things like the National Partnership on Homelessness, housing supply issues and the like.
Okay.
As well as the research agenda for AHURI.
The government also abolished 3 very important peak bodies: Homelessness Australia, National Shelter and the Community Housing Federation of Australia. They're in the process of winding up to save something like $180,000. I think the last time I raised these issues, Senator McLucas, you or one of your colleagues was gracious enough to acknowledge that actually that expertise had been found to be valuable in the past to the department. Who provides you at present with the research and the expert policy advice in those areas of homelessness and housing affordability in the absence of those 3 groups?
Well, sorry, Senator, I don't mean to be difficult, but I wouldn't accept that that the government has abolished those organisations. They continue to exist. I do acknowledge that as part of the MyUFO decisions and under the Housing and Homelessness program, their funding, funding for 2 of the organisations is finishing up a year early.
Yeah.
the funding for the third organisation was due to finish up at the end of February this year. That was extended to the end of June.
Okay.
We understand all three organisations are looking at options for continuing. In terms of your broader question, though, about our engagement, we have in fact had engagement with those three organisations in recent months. We also deal directly with a number of the homelessness service providers, so particularly in the church and charitable sector, and we also engage with our counterparts in state and territory governments who also have the relationships with the service providers.
As the department, I take your point on abolition. I mean, these are technically, they're non-government organisations, so it wasn't really in the Australian government's power to abolish them, but just to pull all the funding out from underneath them. So I acknowledge the distinction that you draw. Has the department started any tendering process to replace the services and advice formerly provided by any of those three bodies?
Senator, I might just address this issue carefully. We had a discussion about this at last estimates as to the reason the money was withdrawn in this area, and it had to do, it wasn't for savings purposes, it was to do with the implications of the Pape and Williams decisions by the High Court. And there is some sensitivity around this because we need to be very careful in how we describe what our advice is on this without giving away the Commonwealth's legal advice and our interests. And so I know that my legal colleagues glad are not sitting behind me, but they're in the other room getting very nervous right now.
I'm sure they've had the good sense to leave.
They will be rushing in if I say much more. But
sorry, can you just? I must have missed a step in the line of logic here. How does that question of constitutionality relate exactly to the defunding of those three peak bodies?
Okay, I will quote from the transcript from the last estimates. I don't believe you're in the room, Senator. And these two quotes from press releases by Minister Morrison at the time these were announced goes as follows. As a result of developments in the background law and the High Court's Pape and Williams decisions, some programs will require redesign to ensure conformity with the law. Some grant agreements will be of 2 years' duration as that redesign process takes place. This will also help to ensure providers have the scope and flexibility to be responsive, innovative and creative in meeting the needs of the community. He went on to say, the government has also sought to focus on areas of primary federal responsibility, especially in light of the recent Williams case that has reframed the funding framework for many services delivered in our communities and removed the federal government from being able to provide direct funding where it previously may have done so. So it is a matter of us not being able to directly provide funding to organisations of that sort as an outcome of those High Court decisions.
My understanding would be you're perfectly entitled to provide funding to any such organisation. You might feel as though it might be subject to legal challenge, although goodness knows who would do such a thing. These people aren't delivering direct services. They're not actually providing roofs over people's heads. They're providing advocacy. So, for example, you didn't pull funding from Ahuri. I understand there's a certain amount of Commonwealth funding that keeps them afloat.
We had an existing contract going there for... So
is that ruled unconstitutional as well? I'm finding this actually really difficult to
Senator, on the Ahuri funding in particular, I think, I likewise need to be careful about running afoul of our Chief Legal Counsel. It is jointly funded between the Commonwealth and states and territories. So there is the distinction between the Commonwealth only funding the peak bodies and the funding for Ahuri is the states and territories do have the constitutional head of power. The fact that it's a joint funding reduces the constitutional risk.
The Commonwealth funds a lot of peak bodies. I can't help but feel as though these three were singled out on a fairly dodgy pretext, to be honest. And I'm not having a go at anybody at the table. You wouldn't have written Mr. Morrison's
Sorry,
press
Senator
statement.
Ludlam.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say,
Thanks.
I think it's really inappropriate to refer to them as dodgy. I think that you should
think-
withdraw that
I'm-
reflection.
Just
I
to
think
clarify, I'm not finding anything that is being expressed at this table tonight dodgy. I think the rationale that Minister Morrison has relied on, given the number of peak bodies that the Commonwealth does provide funding to in some part, to be really dodgy.
Senator, just to be complete, there were a number of other areas where similar decisions were taken in areas outside of housing. Look,
Do we still provide funding to ACOS, for example?
Yes, we do, Senator, and we have looked very carefully at each of the various areas where we do provide funding to advocacy organisations and the basis for which the Commonwealth is able to, under its various constitutional heads of power, provide funding. Now, this is an area where I am going to not get myself into a great deal of trouble, because it is something which I think, if you are particularly interested in, you should raise with the Attorney General's Department, because they oversaw the entire process around this. This, of course, has been an issue for some time, and it in fact preceded the current government coming into power.
So do we need, what's it going to require? Is this, should I take this to mean that the Commonwealth simply will never, we can never expect it to fund variations of organisations like Homelessness Australia again?
I would say it would be preemptive to come to that conclusion. We have the reform of federation process underway, and it is unknown as yet. Here we go. I have many more caveats if you would like them, but...
No, let's hear them, because I'm finding the whole line of argument deeply unconvincing, so give it your best shot.
Well, I might ask my Chief Legal Counsel to come to the table
as you wish.
Deliver the good news directly.
Well, speaking of good news, the Community Housing Federation is having its wind-up party, because they're closing their doors on the 22nd of June, and I'm sure those who provided the legal advice to the Attorney General to close them down would be welcome for those drinks before they shut their doors. Go ahead.
Senator Janine Richards, Chief Legal Counsel. As the Secretary was suggesting, there's quite a background to the position in the constitutional case law as it develops in this space. And the Department's been working with central agencies, Department of Finance and the Attorney General's Department, and has adopted a very cautious process to the development and consideration of our programs against that background of constitutional cases. I think you were referring to some statements that the Minister has made in relation to funding of certain programs. Those statements, I think, we understand reflected his desire to be as transparent as possible with the community about why some of the funding decisions have been taken, but also in this environment we need to be very cautious about maintaining some of our long-standing practices about not disclosing the legal advice that we have received, and to some extent actually answering questions or talking about the legal advice that we've received or the nature of that advice in the context even of individual programs is quite difficult for us, because to do so really wouldn't be in the public interest, particularly if it were to disclose the type or nature of the advice that we've obtained.
I can't see a single public interest immunity argument arising from not being able to tell us why the Commonwealth would continue to fund ACOS but defund Homelessness Australia. Explain to me how the public interest is threatened by you explaining that to me.
Well, I'm saying the public interest would be threatened to the extent that the Commonwealth were to enter in the territory of talking about the nature of the legal advice that it has obtained. And it is difficult for us to actually even identify on an activity or activity basis the work plan that we have, the advice that we have sought, because it's difficult to get into questions about the nature of legal advice or what individual programs might have been the subject of that sort of advice without disclosing the content of the advice.
But we know which services were subject to the advice because they are closing their doors and sacking people as we speak. So some of that's reasonably self-evident. And you didn't write the Constitution. I understand you probably didn't write the briefing or write the law. If you could provide us on notice, because I want to move on, with anything that would help us understand, unless this is perfectly obvious to everybody else and I'm the only one in the room struggling, why the Commonwealth would continue to fund, for example, ACOS, National Disability Services, or AHURI, or any other peak bodies that do advocacy kind of work and provide a really valuable service to the public, why the money's still flowing to them, and why suddenly it was found to be so threatening to continue to fund Homelessness Australia that theirs was pulled. Homelessness Australia, Community Housing Federation and National Shelter.
So, Senator and Ms Richards, stop me if I go too far. The issue is not so much advocacy services, it is to do with the Commonwealth's constitutional powers, and they vary in different areas. You won't be surprised to know that, in fact, we are very interested in many of our areas retaining as many powers as we possibly can, or as many capacities as we possibly can, and so we look for ways to justify that. In some it is easier than others.